I would like to start from the personal angle of things and Anita's personal relationship. I understand that there are parallels between what we saw with the life of this character and the life of your sister. Would you like to elaborate on that for us?
Well, before I start, first of all, I want to thank Milos, Nari, Steve, and Nilesh for organizing this. And more than that, actually, I want to thank all of you for being here. It's 30 years since she has passed away. And it is very heartwarming for me as a sister that the astonishing body of work that she left behind is still revered by many of you and even the younger generation, and people still get inspired by what she portrayed on the film. So Milos, very special thanks to you, and Steve, to you too. Thanks, Derek. I think one of the things what you have seen in Bhumika, first of all, I would like to share with all of you that she did this film when she was barely 21 years of age and had not lived life. So this is a very large canvas for somebody that young to portray. She was also deeply familiar, we all were, because we come from the same region where this book or where this original artist on whose biography or biopic, this is sort of a biopic of Hans Havardkar. What Smee portrayed here is what many of the women then and today experience. So it's not just her. I think it is a complexity of being raised in a traditional fashion. I mean, I don't know if you remember when she leaves the last home, she still goes and touches the feet of that man. It's a very traditional, way of saying to the husband that I am subservient to you. So this is a conflict which many, many women have faced between having been raised, and we all were raised in a lower middle class traditional family. We have seen our mother being devoted to our father, who was always out doing work of nation building because he was a freedom fighter. So on one hand, we were in that traditional mode. On the other hand, what she expresses here is essentially a freedom to be what she wishes to be, a freedom of emotional expression, freedom of sexual expression, a freedom of wanting to make a choice. And I think this is a conflict that she has very elegantly portrayed, and I think the majority of the credit must go to Sean Benegal for imagining this and bringing out the best in Smee. He was actually her best director. He brought some of the best works out of her. So that's what I would like to say.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, there was actually, as I was watching this movie last night at home, I thought that there were parallels to this within some prominent Iranian women, like Forough Farrokhzad, the poet who also became a filmmaker, and she also died at 34 in a car accident, and very comfortable with her sensuality and sense of power in her poetry. And actually one of her films is being distributed here by Facets Multimedia. Milos was one of the first people in the West who kind of recognized their talent. But I want to ask Madhu also about the film and also where Smita Patil fits in that larger panoply of Indian cinema, and also where does this film fit into all of that?
Well, I'll start by, again, saying something personal, which is that for me, Bhumika, from the moment I first saw it, was transformative. And I think being of a generation that grew up watching Smita Patil from a very, very young age, she was not just a tremendous actress for us, but really a role model as a woman. She was the one that we all aspired to be, when we were growing up, because not just because of the way in which she acted and the choices of films that she made, but in her voice, in who she represented. So I think people of my generation, we didn't really aspire to be, any of the Bollywood actresses of that time or anyone in Hindi cinema. It was really Smita Patil and this new Indian cinema that she was so much a part of, that we all we were of that generation that grew up with this cinema and then went backwards and explored great other cinema. And so Shyam Benegal and his films, but particularly Bhumika, I would say, had a huge impact on me personally. And in fact, I remember saying this many years ago to Milos when we were just talking about Indian cinema. So coming back to Smita and this film in particular, and its trajectory within Indian cinema, well, it was such an important film even for Shyam Benegal. The three films that he'd made before this were relatively small, where the new Indian cinema movement was concerned, or what we call parallel cinema, alternative cinema, etc. When you think about the 70s, really that is dominated by the big cinema, the multi-star. 1 year before this film was made, you have the huge hit of Sholay, which completely transformed Indian cinema. The big budget, the one that aspired to be like Hollywood westerns. So within that, the films that Shyam Benegal was making within Hindi film, within the Hindi film industry, was small, transformative, but it was still relatively small. And then came Bhumika, and for all of us who've grown up with this cinema, now when you look back at it, you see all these great actors: Nasiruddin Shah, Kulbhushan, Amrish Puri, Anand Nag, Amol Palekar. I mean, all of them at that time were relatively, young and new. So this whole cinema and this genre, the actors that emerged, these were some of the earliest films by them, and then they went on to create great things with, afterwards. And again, 77, such a critical time in Indian history. When you think about, this is the time of the emergency. This is a time when freedom of expression itself is being challenged, because the kind of films that were being encouraged by the government that was in power, and Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister who removed all press freedoms, were like being sponsored by her Ministry of Information. In that time, to have a film like this with the kind of canvas that it was portraying, and this multi-layered character who you see over such a long period of time. I mean, the only thing one could compare Shyam Benegal's Bhumika to at that point was Ray. I mean, you really went back to the 50s again to kind of find resonance of what he was doing with this film. So I think now when we look back, we forget that, that was such a transformative period, not just for all of us growing up, but for Indian cinema. It was at the start of this whole movement, which now, of course, has fed back into Indian cinema, but one forgets how impactful it was at that time.
Yeah, certainly. And Milos, how about in terms of cinema? Where do you think this film?
Well, I'll just give you, a couple impressions. I mean, the thing about this film, which is just so amazing, is just the sheer ambition of it and the scale of it. It's really taking on, the canvas that it takes on is just so enormous, and I think very few films and very few filmmakers anywhere have tackled something so complex that go through so many relationships, so many different levels. And when you look at those, the second thing that I was thinking about is how just brilliant Benegal was in this film in not creating something which was very, like Ray, or something that which was very separate and apart, and this kind of local story, but how, in a way, he situated it still within the studio system, but now, as an outsider, it's a critical view, in a way, of the commercial Bollywood industry. And then this, besides the procession of men, of course, the way that women generally are portrayed in a way as part of a system that keeps empowering and re-empowering this male-dominated society. You know, in the mother, for example, the grandmother, I mean, the first wife in that last relationship. I mean, you see all of these women who have been forced into partaking and being a part of that system. And then even the level of how he situates this in terms of historically, because through the radio you hear the Stalin has died, and it's Pakistan. So you have a sense of time in which you're situated, so it doesn't become just so abstract. And then having placed it inside the Bollywood critical system, it allows him to really differentiate the real life that Smita is portraying versus this movie life, which is feeding this fantasy, which in a way is part of that whole power structure which continues and which sets this up. So, you know, lastly, just about Smita and her performance, I mean, I think it's just so striking of how you can't say that the camera loved her. I think what you can say is that she forced the camera to love her, because she is such a physical force in each time, and so it's not like having that filmmaker create something around her. She is driving it every split second of the way. So yes, Benegal was probably the filmmaker who really knew best how to use her, but she's the one who really drove the agenda. This is an actor's film as much as a director's film.
It's really popping through even from the first few seconds of the film. It's coming right at you, and then when you read the subtitles and the translations of the poems, you know, that's right away I thought of.
The subtitles, of course, are very bad.
But that's really. Does the word bhumika mean role, actually? Yeah, that's because it's really...
It's about role-playing.
Role-playing, exactly.
Portrayal.
Yeah.
Portrayal.
Portrayal, yeah.
So
So this...
be a better translation.
I see, okay. Well, that's really very key, actually. That's kind of giving you a very subtle subtle signal as to what's going on here between reality and the film and all of that, the layering of it. Anita, what was your sister like to be, what was it like to have a sister like this? Was she as powerful, as she as charismatic within the family affairs as she was on cinema?
Once she crossed the Dahliz and came inside the house, she was a loving daughter, a loving sister, and as ordinary as any one of us. So my mother was a fairly strict woman, and she would always say, your national awards outside of the house. And I'm going to share a story which none of you would believe, but it's true. This was after 1977. She had won a national award for Bhumika. Of course, we were not, we are not a film family, so we did not know what the hell national award means. I mean, it was as bad as that. Neither did my mother know what Padma Shri meant. I mean, we were like different, we grew up in a Gandhian family steeped in Nehruvian socialism. Both my parents dedicated their lives to a newly free nation building. So the cinema and everything was out of our spheres. So anyway, Smee has gotten a national award and she comes home and then my mother says, okay, somebody's coming to meet you, so please clean up your room. We didn't have paraphernalia of servants like a typical Indian family. We came from a very, very modest background, and both my sister and myself went to Marathi school, a vernacular school. We were not English educated, and we were the first generation learners in my family. So I know none of you are going to believe this, but that's the truth. So anyway, my mother says, okay, go quickly clean the room. So, and she got back to the kitchen. After for 20-25 minutes, my mother comes to the room, Smee's on the phone. That time we didn't have mobile phones, those landlines. And those people are already at the door and the room is in such a huge mess. So I don't know, we have a ruler in the house, we had a ruler. My mother was so furious, she literally hit my sister with the ruler and broke it on her body. This is when Smee was 22 years of age. This is how our family was.
How was she discovered by the film industry?
One of my very dear friend's wife was a newsreader on the television. And me and this friend, we both were in med school, so we used to go visit her all the time. And this friend of mine was a very close friend of mine. For him, Smita was a model for his photography because he was a good photographer. She was terrific as a model. So she often used to take him to photograph her, and then he would come. We'll go back and show his wife, oh look, this is my model, such great photographs, etc. One evening, and she was an evening news reader, so we went there to show the new set of photographs. And he had laid all of these down, and Mr. Krishnamurthy, who was the television executive director, he was just walking by. He had seen us. He used to say, what the hell are you guys doing here? So he came and he looked at those photographs and he said, who is this person? Who is this woman? So Deepak, my friend, said, oh, she's my model, she's my very special model. So he said, just bring her in because I'm looking desperately for a Hindi news reader. And she looks like a good face, so bring her in. So Mr. Krishnamurthy says to me, so Deepak says, okay, Anita, you bring her in. I said, I'm not doing this because I knew Smee will say no. I was confident because she was not into all of this. So I said, I'm not taking this risk. If you want, she's your model, you go and bring her. So he put her on his scooter and he took her to the television station. Mr. Krishnamurthy interviewed her, and it was just about the time that Bangladesh had just become independent. She sung the national anthem of Bangladesh in Bengali. She was multilinguistic and had a lovely voice. He took her up, and my mother had to sign for her because she was underage. That's how it all started. So she had no intentions ever of becoming anything, and until Bhumika, she was not even sure if this is what she wanted to pursue.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Madhu, what else do you want to say about the 70s in terms of Indian art and the trends, and how are they continuing these days?
Well, the 70s was kind of formative in many ways because, the 50s was a great period in Indian cinema, and then the 60s, there was of course some good films, but when color came into Indian cinema, it all tended to go into songs and dances. And while there was, good cinema still, it's the beginning of what we see of the Hindi film industry as such. I think one of the things that most people here, of course, might be familiar with, but generally India has so many film industries, and we're really talking about the Hindi film industry because the trajectory in the South or in Bengal or in Maharashtra and in Kerala, Gujarat, Punjab, each of these regions has their own film industry, and of course in Bengal we have a huge history of film. But coming back to the Hindi film industry, of course, this transition and the emergence of the star system, the stars started to appear from the 50s, but really in the 60s and early 70s they started to really become superstars. And so content I think the narrative started to kind of suffer in that process. But as Anita herself talked about, this was a period of Nehruvian socialism, and there were a lot of filmmakers coming from a slightly more leftist socialist platform into cinema. And Shyam Benegal and others, one didn't think of it as socialist cinema. It was really, India itself was socialist in those days. So this was just part of the new phenomena of, looking at smaller stories, not trying to, the economics of the Hindi film industry by then was such that you were trying to be pan-Indian, while in this genre that kind of started with Shyam Benegal, you could take the smaller stories and you could kind of build a film around it, and there slowly started to be an audience for that. And I think for me particularly, but I think for people who loved Indian cinema, this whole movement of the new Indian cinema was very, very critical in the development of Hindi films generally, because I think it, in the long run, as the two parts of this movement started to come together, I think in Hindi cinema itself became better, because many of these actors that started in this movement eventually, like Smita Patil, joined the mainstream too. And so acting became more natural. One of the things that really I want to pick up from what Milos was saying about this film are the nuances. For example, the way music is used. You talked about the translations, but in fact, it's the nuances of the words of the songs which is so haunting. The one thing that throughout you saw Agni Pariksha, you start the film with this shot of the screen of Agni Pariksha, which was, some movie which was passing through. That's right, at the beginning. Agni Pariksha, of course, is a reference to the test by fire of Sita in the Ramayana, the great Indian epic, the Ramayana, which every Indian woman here would understand. But it's that reference of the woman being tested. And you hear that reference throughout, like repeatedly, right till the end. There are all kinds of nuances of the glance, the gaze. We can sit here and talk forever about the different people who are looking at themselves in the mirror. So cinematically, things that at that time in Indian cinema were new, but which were part of cinema worldwide, were being shown for the first time. And I think these are some of the key things that one often forgets because of the overwhelming personality of Smita. The film itself is crafted in such an exquisite manner that you kind of all these cross-referencing that is happening throughout. Maybe you want to add something.
I do want to share that in Bhumika, every time there is an intense critical scene, you will notice her changing her sari.
Yes.
It's a classic indication. And also, every time there is a change in relationship, she comes back dancing. So that is a change. It is an indication of a change which has happened from here to there, there to there, there to there. And I want to add something personal too. So in that dance, there is a lot of bust movement. It's an erotic movement, and my sister simply couldn't do it when she started. So Shyam picked up the phone and called my mother, saying, she's doing a lousy job, I'm so frustrated. Because, that evening when Smee came home, my mother just gave it to her. She said, you have accepted this? I don't want to hear this story that this is, sensuous and erotic and this and that. Either you do it well or you quit. She gave her a big firing, and next day my mother, without telling Smee but telling Shyam, went to the studio and stood in the wings to make sure she did She did it well. This was my mother, and I would give a huge amount of credit. So at the end of the day, if the world praised my sister's role, she couldn't care less. Until the praise came from her mother, she wasn't satisfied, because that was the final bar that she had to pass.
Yeah, another thing that was wondering in my mind was that 1977 is when there's been some distance from the independence and the anti-colonialism, where you can say it's almost the post-colonial moment is being re-evaluated by some folks. And I'm trying to think about where there might have been some larger cultural trends that might have contributed to Midnight Children and Salman Rushdie and Homi Bhabha writing his cultural criticism about the performative aspect of life being identity formation. And some of those themes seem to be running through. I can't quite put my finger on it yet, but I'm thinking that this have been the zeitgeist where post-colonial analysis and theory starts to get born over here.
Well, it's a very critical time. I think most of us are just beginning to understand what the emergency meant from an artistic and from generally kind of, because the focus was so much on politics, and the focus was so much in just kind of just getting through that. The whole protests, the kind of underground subversive movements to kind of get rid of emergency and get rid of this person and then bringing in a new government, that was transformative for most people. And I mean, of course, the whole of India was impacted in different ways by emergency, but I think that certainly that whole period of 76, 77 has had a huge impact, but I don't think we've truly addressed it in the same way that, say, we're just beginning to understand independence and post-independence, like partition. So I think within the arts, it's going to take us a little bit longer to really truly self-reflect and analyze this period. I think we're just at the outset of that process.
We go to the audience without further ado. If you have any questions, unless Milos, you have something to add.
All I was going to say is his question is, so where did Cheyenne Benegal get his ideas to make this kind of film? And I would say, obviously we've had, and I interviewed him before, so obviously he was influenced by neorealism, as many filmmakers were, and by that time the French New Wave was there. But what I think is remarkable is that rather than emulating it or copying it or borrowing some of those techniques or some of the things that the French filmmakers did, or for that matter Rossellini or Fellini or anybody else, he really just took it and very much made it his own. So it's like someone who really, really learns, then throws everything that he's learned away and goes and does his own artwork. And that's really the best kind of learning. So in that sense, his work and Smita's work is so authentic